Wendy, can you just introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about who you are, what your experience has looked like over the last couple of decades in this space.
Great, thank you. I'm Dr. Wendy Heckelman. I'm the principal and founder of WH Consulting and Learning Solutions. It's hard to believe that I've actually been in business for 30 years, specializing in strategic change and execution, which has been the basis of Change and Thrive.
And what inspired you to write Change and Thrive, which is a modern approach to change leadership?
I need to first say, and I think Tiana, you know this book launched March 3rd of 20, about a week before the lockdown. It's more relevant than it was then, or just as relevant. What inspired me was I've been practicing for literally 30 years, helping organizations navigate large-scale change. And one of the things we know is that most organizations fail at this. In fact, 70% fail. And through a ton of research and a lot of practical experience and hundreds of client engagements, we really broke down the two primary reasons for that failure, which is really the lack of a strategic execution implementation approach, right? Is a cascade, as well as the leader's ability to guide others through transition, not change. Change is done to you. Transition's a response. And we've seen organizations bring in big firms after big firms after big firms, and they still flounder and they fail for these two primary reasons. So we wanted, and I wanted this to be a guide, a useful tool and resource to any leader at any point in their career without having to call a large consulting firm or a small consulting firm. So the genesis was to empower those who would be the recipients or the implementers of change, which is really just about everybody, a way forward and a way to think about it.
So what I'm hearing is, some of the big firms come in with a very high level strategy, very high level execution plan to cascade things through the organization, but it's not always translating to some of those leaders who are actually on the front lines. Is that fair?
That's fair. And the other thing we would say is, they pay attention to other elements, process redesign, communication, plans. This approach, the 5 C's of transition leadership, which is really the basis of the book, is a very much an active leader-led approach. Because what do we know? We know that if you don't get leaders committed and onboarded to whatever the change is, it's going to be very hard for them to work with their teams, clarify those implications, and successfully navigate that for their teams and for their people. We are now at a point that every organization is going through fundamental disruptive change as a result of the pandemic and post-pandemic responses. And the need for having change leadership or leadership agility skills is more important today than it ever was.
Well, speaking of the major disruption, I'm really curious from your seat in the healthcare and pharmaceutical industry, what kinds of disruptions are you still seeing to date, right? Like it's 2022, many people are talking about post-pandemic this, post-pandemic that, but yeah, and I saw that look on your face. So what disruptions are you still seeing?
So yes, I know that we all would like to be in a post-pandemic operating model, but that's not the reality. So I want to first talk about the context of the external environment, because pharma relates to healthcare institutions, medical practitioners, large academic medical centers, payers. What do we know? We know that access is still very restricted. Why is that? Because they are still dealing with COVID patients and then the delay of care that has happened as a result of the pandemic. People haven't gotten their MRIs, they haven't gone for cardiovascular, their diabetes may be out of control. So access continues to be an issue in healthcare, and it is very disrupted. The other piece is we have the macro environment where the great resignation is upon us. that people are changing their contract with employers and people are leaving. And that's putting a real drain on organizations to fill critical roles, because most of these are knowledge-based roles, which are so hard to replace. And then the third factor is the real need to have inclusive environments that are where people's thoughts and ideas are part of decision making and discussion. So what I would say is, I do not know a pharma company today, a biotech company today, an animal health medicines company today that is not fundamentally revisiting their strategy, which changes then role expectations, key performance indicators, getting people aligned around ways that they need to work together. All of that is still going on in a context where people are working hybrid and will probably continue to work hybrid for quite some time, particularly in the farm industry.
And I love that you bring up what almost sounds like minor disruptions, but whenever you kind of collate all of them and share them all in one fell swoop, it's easier to recognize how disruptive they can really be to our, to our employees and to our teams. And so I'm curious then, because a lot of times in the work that we see with the larger firms and whatnot, change and the way that it's cascaded in organizations, it needs to be a massive corporate company-wide large-scale change project. And so do you find that the lessons taught in Change and Thrive apply to things on that macro level as well as that micro level?
I do. I think they definitely talk about the macro level, the importance of communication, the importance of change groups and guiding coalitions. I think where Change and Thrive is different, and why I say it's a practical guide, is it teaches an individual leader an approach on how they think about change. That because change is done to you, like I said, transitions your response. So what as a leader do you need to do? First, you got to be on board. You got to be committed. Well, if you're not committed, how the heck are you going to get all your other folks committed? You have to assess risks to the business for continuity and through the change. Maybe I've changed my strategy so fundamentally that people need new skills and new abilities. Well, how I need to mitigate that and make sure we can get that. But it really focuses on the human dynamics of what people go through change. It is a process, and transition is that process. COVID was done to everybody. Organizations responded to it. And I think that what the goal here was to provide a simple framework that you can reuse over and over and over again, because sometimes the change isn't fundamental and disruptive. Sometimes it's small and iterative, but people still need clarity. And this approach really takes the thought at the organizational level, what needs to happen? What does an individual manager need to do with his or her teams? And how do you support individuals in their personal journey through the change process?
Well, since we're talking about individuals, I'd love to spend just a little bit of time talking about the individual leaders and the people that have actually utilized this method and have seen success in utilizing the Change and Thrive approach. So can you speak to just some past clients, some past examples where you've really seen them use this approach and thrive as a result of it?
Absolutely. So working with a global top pharmaceutical company, when this method, before it was put on paper and written into a book, we started this approach nearly 20 years ago. And this organization went through a series of 4 mergers. And what happened is we were part of the team of consultants they assembled. Some worked at the really macro level, some worked at different levels. And that's really where we introduced the 5 C's of transition leadership. And it was really to work through this merged organization. What happened is this organization subsequently had another acquisition, and then one point a spinoff. And this became the lexicon and the framework by which people talked about how do we implement change. And they knew how quickly to rally their leaders, make sure there was clarity. They identified risks and then worked to jumpstart their teams and then do transition coaching. In March of 20, we were working with another organization, a mid-sized pharma company that was doing a fundamental transformation, by the way, when everybody was locked down and on Zoom. And what we learned is that we certainly needed to deploy the approach differently, but we were able to because leadership commitment was a real concern. So we have applied this method in the animal health industry. We've applied it multiple times within pharma, big and small, as well as in other industry segments as well. What I would say is the key takeaway for an organization is that they've got to understand the human impact of a change, regardless of its size, shape, or type, and that people are who power your organization. So not to have an intentional focus on helping a person understand and translate that strategy as to what does it mean to the work I'm a part of? What does it mean to me personally? What do I need to do to be ready and committed? Is really a great failure. And that's why so many of these large-scale change initiatives fail.
Mm. Can you speak to maybe even just a case of a manager or a director level leader who maybe was a bit resistant to the process, maybe had a little bit more struggle getting on gear with the entire, like, this is not just change, this is transition, here's how to take your team through it. I'd love if you could speak a little bit to that individual person's experience as they learned this approach and actually applied it with their team.
So I think what I would say is there's always reluctance, right? I've been there, I've seen this. Okay, this is another flavor, this is another style kind of thing. There's 4 or 5 types of those. Most of the time, we don't encounter resistance because we start and focus with the leaders. So if you're talking about an individual manager, that individual manager is part of a group of other managers. But when we talk about it, it's practical. It makes sense for you to say, okay, I need to understand the strategy so I can get on board, so I can then figure out how to help my team. That's logic. It's also logical as a leader, manager, to say, I've got to think about the risk to my people, because what's changing for them and what's staying the same? And what's changing, are they going to have some problems and do we need to help them? That's pretty logical. Now, what's the communication plan? So if we've encountered resistance, it's usually that there's some change management consultant that's helping the organization. Typically, when we introduce the framework and we introduce kind of the core concepts and give them the tools, right? This is not just a book that's nice to talk about in a narrative. We actually give tools and we give them ways to capture that information. They find it practical and useful. And we've done tons of post surveys and postmortems and after action reviews. And what they say is it's practical. Most of them believe it should be embedded in any leadership training, because as a leader, you are always going to have change. And your huge responsibility is to be able to guide your individuals and teams through that change transition so they can start to perform.
Well, then let's fast forward and put ourselves, towards the tail end of this year. Maybe we've actually arrived at what we could characterize as a post-pandemic world. Do you think most organizations, teams, and individuals, like across all of the levels, do you think that they're adequately prepared to actually thrive?
Probably not. In terms of being equipped with the core capabilities we're talking about, I think that's one of the failures that I see organizationally. Because as you asked the question, are they always big? Well, change is something that you're always going to need to do, to be able to guide your teams and individuals through that. And I think having a practical framework and tools that you can pull out when you need them that are intuitive is helpful. I mean, we work so much alongside large corporations, consulting firms that do the big change strategic work. And we're usually the implementers, or certainly the ones that upskill the leaders. I do believe that there is more attention today to the human dynamics, right? Because of all the other factors we were talking about, the Great Resignation, the need to have inclusion. But my belief is people have to be shepherds of human behavior and stewards of that. And they need the acumen to understand that you can't just announce a change and think it's going to stick. That you need to, with as much effort as you would put in terms of defining performance targets, you need to put in guiding yourself, your people, your teams through successful change.
And to that point, it sounds to me, correct me if I'm wrong, you can push back on this, but it sounds to me like you're an advocate for incorporating this sort of leadership development even before there's some big change initiative or even a minor change initiative going on in the organization. Like, we need to upskill and equip these leaders ahead of time, because this is something that's just going to happen back to back to back to back forevermore. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I mean, when you're doing it within the context of a huge change, you sometimes can organize people better. You can get groups and cohorts together. But it is my belief that leadership agility and the ability to guide through change is a critical component of any manager, from first line leader all the way to the top of the house.
Okay. Well, speaking of our leaders, then what advice do you have for new leaders? Maybe they've gotten a promotion, became the leader of a new team. What advice do you have for these leaders as they continue this journey of trying to figure out how they are going to change and thrive?
I think shore up your change leadership capabilities, do some readings, take a look at the book. There's also on WH Consulting's website tons of free resources, but it's really to understand that going through a change takes time and takes continued effort. One and dones don't work. If you think about something as simple as teaching your child to ride a bike, right? Can't do that once. It takes reinforcement. Thinking about toilet training, right? It's trial and error, it's practice, and then, you can learn a new behavior. Learning the capabilities that really power change leadership is what we're talking about. And it's awareness, and it's really following simple steps for yourself, for your teams, and for others. So I would say, pick up a copy of the book, read it. It's pretty self-explanatory. Everything you need to do to affect change is certainly there in it.
Well, I definitely validate and support that. I think that this is a fantastically practical book and I've heard it in some of the reviews and testimonials from past clients and whatnot that have purchased the book themselves, that this is something that they can definitely refer back to time and time again as things come up and as needed. So thank you for your work on this, Wendy. It is a gift to this industry for sure.
Well, thank you. And it was really a labor of love, as you know, Tiana, to kind of put this out. Timing is everything. So I wish it had gotten a little bit more traction back in March, but I think we were focused, but I think it's actually really relevant now, because even within Change and Thrive, the book, we talk about retention and how important it is and give tips and techniques there. So we either press against or the issues that were present prior to March of 20 are just here today, but they're on steroids. So I hope that anybody takes a read will find it helpful and useful, and certainly reach out if you have any questions.